All right, so today's topic, less and faster, caching tips for WordPress developers. So I'm Otto Kekäläinen. I'm one of the founders of Seravo, and we are running a premium WordPress and hosting company out of Finland. And we host about 4,000 websites. And from those websites, we've collected quite a lot of experience of what are the common problems for running the websites and also regarding developing the websites. So we are not doing website development ourselves. We're not a digital agency. We are completely focused on upkeep. That is making sure that the sites run well in production. So my first contact with WordPress was in 2005. I made some blog during my studies, but WordPress wasn't very good at the time, so I didn't continue with it that time. But then in 5 or 6 years ago, WordPress was much better, and I came back to it and started doing lots of work around WordPress. I have experience with developing WordPress plugins and WordPress sites, but nowadays we are focused completely on upkeep. And caching, I think, is a very interesting topic. Yeah, so a little bit about Seravo. So we don't like to talk about us as just a hosting company, because we do much more. First of all of our customers and all the sites we run are business sites, and they are all in 24/7 monitoring, which means that if they have an issue, then some human from Seravo will go and check out what's going on. And we are not just providing the server environment. Actually, providing the server environment is just a necessity we need to do to be able to provide good upkeep and security and backups and have a very fast environment that is completely optimized for WordPress. And as a proof that our environment is very well optimized, you can go and check out this is my host fastyet.com, which is published by Google employees, and it's based on telemetry from the Chrome browser. So the Chrome browser is collecting data from its users and sending it back to Google, and based on that data they do all kinds of statistics and analysis of how well Chrome is performing. And one of the statistics they are able to do is to extract that what sites out there in the live load quickly and which load slowly. And they've published this comparison of different hosts which have on average the fastest sites, and we are ranking there as the fastest WordPress hoster. And the reason why I'm talking about caching is because it's a very fundamental thing in performance and speed, and it's also very difficult to get right. Here's a famous quote: "There are only 2 hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things." Some of you maybe heard about this before. And this is not WordPress specific, this is in general for computer science. So caching is a good thing to do, but you easily get it wrong and end up showing old contents to users when they shouldn't see it. So caches is a generic thing in computer science, and they actually exist everywhere, and you are always using cache in many places all of the time. So here are some of the examples of places where you can find caches. There is cache inside the CPU itself. Some of you have maybe heard about this, levels 1 through 4. And by caching data inside the CPU, you save time because you don't need to fetch it from the main memory over and over again. There are also caches in many places in the operating system. For example, Linux automatically caches stuff you are reading from the hard drive so that you don't need to be continuously reading the same file from the hard drive. And many programs have built-in caches, so there are many built-in caches in PHP itself that works automatically. For example, they prevent that the same files are not read over and over again, and the same PHP code is not converted to machine code over and over again if the file hasn't changed. In the database, there's also lots of cache being used to prevent too much access to the hard drive. And inside WordPress specifically, there are things like object cache and transients. And I'm going to tell you more about them soon. And these are just a couple of examples, and the list is long. So why do we have caches everywhere? Well, obviously because of speed. So think about it. Can you say instantly how much is 5 times 5? Yes, it's 25. Everybody knows that because that is something you have been practicing in school so that you can say immediately how much it is. But then how much is 55 times 555? Well, it will probably take you tens of seconds to calculate that. And why do we know this 5 by 5 out of our memory? Because it's a common calculation and our teachers thought it would be good for us to learn them by heart because we're going to need it often. However, we're not going to need often or probably never need to calculate 55 times 555. So caching is used everywhere to prevent that you don't have to do complex calculations that you need often. So it's a good thing to save stuff in cache that you need often. And here are some numbers every coder should know. So these are retrieval times for different type of memories. So the fastest possible memory and also the most expensive one can be found inside the CPU. And that's why the CPU has level 1, 2, 3, and even 4, because they are different sizes. The most expensive one is L1, but it's also the smallest one. Then outside of the CPU, we have the main memory, random access memory, and you can see it's an order of magnitude slower than the memory inside the CPU. And then stuff that doesn't fit in the main memory is stored permanently on hard drives. And nowadays, there are basically 3 technologies for hard drives. There's PCIe NVMe hard drives, which most of Seravo's customers are running on, where it takes about 2000 nanoseconds to fetch data. And then there are solid state disks, which is an order of magnitude slower, but still pretty fast. And then there is the traditional disks, the hard drive, spinning hard drives, which I hope nobody is using anymore because they are really, really slow. And then also you should consider the latency between computers. And here's an example that from my city where I live, Tampere to Berlin, the latency is 30 million nanoseconds. That is 30 milliseconds. So obviously, if you have something you want to do a computation on and it's inside the CPU, that's the fastest. And if you need to fetch it over the network from some other computer, that's going to be the slowest. And then here is also 2 extra figures more to consider. Here is if you are serving something from WordPress itself and you're running PHP, it's going to take 50 milliseconds or even up to a second for PHP to print out an HTML page. However, if that is cached and it's printed out from the web server, for example, Nginx, it's going to take just a couple of milliseconds. So that's way faster. This is related to things you can do in caching with WordPress. Has any of you seen this table before? It's a pretty famous one. If you have any questions, you can just send them, or any comments, you can put them in the chat box and I will keep an eye on that. So these numbers are good to keep in mind so that you know if you can take a smaller amount of data and keep it in memory and do your computation on that, you will be an order of magnitude faster than if you have to constantly fetch stuff from the hard drive. So should you put everything in memory? Should you cache everything? So obviously you can't, because memory is more expensive than the hard disks. So it makes sense only to put stuff in memory which is frequently used. And there are a couple of strategies how to approach this. So for example, you can put stuff in cache, and then you can have a command that clears that cache when it's no longer needed. And then you can also have, for example, counters in computers or in software that calculate or count how many times some data is used. And if it's been retrieved many times, then it's put in cache, or maybe it's put in cache on the first time but kept in cache as long as somebody is still using that. And then there is also the concept of expiring. You can have data that is put in a cache somewhere, and it has a time, like for example, how many seconds or how many minutes it's valid. And then automatically, after that time has passed, then it will expire and be removed from the cache. And the difficult part is, especially in this cache expires, how long will some data be valid? Is it 5 seconds, 60 seconds, 15 minutes, or 7 days? And it always depends on the use case. So that's why it's so difficult to get right, and people often make mistakes in their assumptions regarding how long some data can be valid. And here are a couple of other concepts related to caching, which are good to understand, so that when you read about caching and think about it, you get all the concepts correct in your mind. So retrieval time is the table I showed. The faster the memory is, the faster the place you are retrieving the data from, the faster the system will work. Invalidation is the criteria when data is to be deleted, and then you need to do a new computation to get the data. Expiry is the time in which data expires and removed from cache. And bypass means that when you're fetching some information, then you deliberately bypass the cache. So there are cases when you want to keep stuff in the cache, you don't want to invalidate it, but for single fetches you want to bypass the cache and get the latest data. And then there is the concepts of miss and hit rate. So miss happens when you are fetching some data, and you would have been okay with using cached data, but the cache was empty. So you need to compute the data. And hit is when you are fetching the data and you found it from the cache. And obviously, for a cache to work well, you should have a high hit rate, so that most of the time when you're fetching some data, most of the time when the software is doing repeatedly the same thing over and over again, it's using cached data and the hit rate is high. All right, so what about caches in the context of WordPress? So here are things for a WordPress site developer to consider. So there is the browser HTTP cache layer, and that's always the fastest. That's the layer that is in the browser at the user. So if the browser is loading some site and it can fetch stuff from the local computer or from its own memory, and it doesn't have to fetch it over the network, then that will always be the fastest solution. Then there is the server level HTTP cache. To implement that, you usually use something like Nginx or Varnish or some maybe Cloudflare or Fastly or some other CDN service. And using the server level HTTP cache means that you are not running WordPress or PHP itself, and that is much faster. And then inside WordPress, there are transients. And then you basically can get the information by knowing the key of the transient and then getting it like that. We will go deeper into code examples soon. And then there is also something called object cache inside WordPress. And when you're dealing with WordPress, you should also consider what kind of server environment it's running in. Do you have file system cache? And then obviously database is often a bottleneck. And if you have good database level caching configured, then the database and retrieval of data from the database will be faster. And if you now go and Google for WordPress caching, you will get tons and tons of results of blog posts and guides recommending installing all kinds of plugins. And usually, as I say, the plugins are not the solution. It's quite often the source of your problems. So it might be a band-aid or a quick solution for something, but it will probably also cause a lot of problems. And as a WordPress developers, you should get past the level of just using plugins and understand what's actually going on in your PHP and WordPress code. So let's start diving into the browser HTTP cache. The objective here is to avoid unnecessary network traffic between the end user browser and the server. And the browser is automatically always storing all kinds of pages and assets it's downloading from the server, and it's doing that based on what the HTTP headers say. So for this to work correctly, you need to learn what HTTP headers are. You need to make sure that your site is sending out sensible HTTP headers and expiration dates for your content. And WordPress is not doing this by default. So you need to dig into it a little bit. So here is an example of a curl request to a single style sheet file. And Seravo.com here is as an example. How many of you are familiar with curl? You can put in the chat thumbs up or something. So curl is a great command line tool, and it's great for testing HTTP headers and testing redirects and other stuff, because curl is not caching anything by itself. If you're doing this test with a browser, you might be looking at something that the browser has earlier cached, and you might get the wrong results. And curl is handy because it's available on all platforms. It's very easy to just fire a HTTP request and look at what's happening. So here I'm running curl with a capital I and a capital L. Capital I means that show me the headers and don't show anything else, and capital L means to follow all redirects. And these are the parameters I most often use with curl when I'm testing out something. And here you can see the HTTP headers coming back from the server. And here I've bolded a couple of lines, the expires and cache control. And these are specifically HTTP headers which control and which tell the browser how long the content is valid, and if the browser at all can cache anything of this, and if it caches, then for how long. And in this example, you can see that the content is valid for 7 days. And this actually, if it's 7 days or 30 days or anything, doesn't really matter, because the point here is that if a user comes to this site again not in a time span of minutes, but in a time span of several days, and they have a completely new session, then the site might load much faster because these assets are already found in the local browser cache. And here you can see something that WordPress has built in. So you can see at the end is this version argument, version equals 5.3.2. And this exists there for the purpose that if you update your WordPress, this is a WordPress core file. So if you update your WordPress core version to something else, then that number is going to increase. And since that number will be different, then any page loads after WordPress has been updated will stop referencing this old style sheet file and will forcefully load new style sheets from the server. So if this wouldn't happen, then it would break the contents for 7 days potentially for old visitors. But since the address is changing, then they will get a new content as soon as WordPress has been updated. And here is another example from your team. So if you use a existing team or if you roll your own team, then you should note that when the team is referencing its own assets, style sheets or JavaScript files, it should also have this version component at the end of the URL. This ensures that when you have a new version of the theme, then that version number is going to be bumped, and then all references to that CSS file or JavaScript file or whatever assets file you have will have a new version number, and it will ensure that the browsers will load the new version. And here is a little tip of what we are doing, since we are constantly updating our theme and developing our website. And it's cumbersome to always manually bump the theme version. So what we've done is that when we're using this VP-enqueue style or VP-enqueue script functions to register asset files to WordPress, instead of using the theme version, we use this custom function that checks out what is the git commit ID, and then it appends there. So every time there is a new git commit rolled out into production, then all references to style sheets and JavaScript files will automatically update. And you can also use something like this based on the modification time of the file. If you want, it will lead to the same end result. And if you're developing WordPress sites, then this is something you need to consider, that you have your versioning scheme for your style sheets and JavaScript files correctly. Then the cache will work as it should. All right, so in dynamic files, the validity period comes from PHP. And since WordPress itself doesn't set any default expiration date, you need to do it yourself, for example, in your code, in your theme header.php file. And here is a code example for that. Here we define that the content is valid for 1 hour. And then we define the expires and cache control headers and send them out using the PHP function header. This will result in a printout like that in the server headers. So this you can use to control what kind of headers your WordPress pages themselves are doing. And then to control what kind of headers you have with your static files, you need to configure your server to do that correctly. And at Seravo, we have configured it already so that all static files or CSS files and JavaScript files have automatically an expiration time of 7 days, which is a good default and will prevent users having to download these same asset files over and over again if they're returning to the site within a week. Sometimes you might see this expiration date 11th of January 1984 when you are looking at your WordPress installation and running curl or other ways looking at the HTTP headers. And if you see this, then this is a sign that something in the code has triggered the no cache headers function, because this date is the birthday of Matt Mullenweg, and this is specifically emitted by WordPress core code itself. So it means that you are somewhere in the code, maybe in the theme or plugin or something, is using the no cache headers function. Or it could also mean that you have the WordPress debug mode on, because if you have the WordPress debug mode, then the WordPress core will emit these headers for every request. So if you want to make sure that some page specifically never is cached by the browser, then you can also use this header on some page. All right, so then the next level, server HTTP cache. So this is actually quite easy because it's following exactly the same HTTP headers as the browsers are doing. So if you've checked that your HTTP headers are okay and sensible and sending out sensible headers for content expiration, then your server level HTTP cache will work automatically as well. And what does the server level HTTP cache mean? So here is an example. At Seravo, we have this command which you can access by SSH called VP speed test, and it's specifically designed to measure how fast your WordPress is. So it's bypassing all caches by default so that it forces the PHP and WordPress to run and generate the HTML page. But you can give it the flag --cache, and then it will allow caching to happen if the server does caching. And in this example, you can see that if the result is fetched from the server cache, then it's like 10 to 15 to 20 times faster. So this is really good to have working. And again, this all depends on the HTTP headers, which are completely standard. And if you don't know how HTTP headers work, so to facilitate that, we also have a command, vp check HTTP cache, which will load your site and check what kind of HTTP headers you have. And in this example, it will show you that you are constantly missing the cache and it doesn't seem to be working. And you have these headers emitted. And since you specifically have this 11th of January 1984, then you know that you probably have VP debug on, or some other place in the code is triggering this no cache headers function. And here again is an example that if the HTTP cache is working correctly, then this command will tell you that it's a success and server level caching is working. All right. So this most of the time HTTP level caching makes sense, but obviously an exception is any page that has content that is customized for one user only. For example, if it's saying hello Otto, then you don't want to show that to all of your users. You want to show it specifically only to the user with that name. Or if you have a shopping cart with certain items, then you obviously only want to show that shopping cart to one single user. So in those use cases, you don't want to have the server or the browser doing any caching. So how this works is that by default, in WooCommerce, for example, the second you are clicking to add an item into your shopping cart, then WordPress or WooCommerce will set these two cookies, WooCommerce cart hash and WooCommerce items in cart cookie. And when you have these cookies, they can store some data. And in addition to that, having cookies by themselves tells the browser and the server cache that now that there is some kind of session going on, now there is some kind of customized content, and then that will bypass all caching automatically. So this is good to understand, because then you know that this content is not being cached. And sometimes if you have some stupid plugins that are setting cookies for every single user, then you know that plugin and those cookies are set in vain, and it will also burst your cache completely. And sometimes also it's good to realize, specifically because some CDN services like Cloudflare, for example, are very popular, and they are advertising that they will always speed up the server by having an extra caching layer outside of the server. Well, in some cases this works, but it doesn't necessarily always work. So consider this example that you have a WooCommerce site served on a server in Helsinki, and then you have a user in Berlin. So if they are fetching the content directly from the server, then the delay will be the time it takes for a HTTP2 connection to open and fetch the page from Helsinki server. And it could be, let's say, 90 milliseconds. But then if you have a separate server doing caching somewhere else, then what happens is that there will be two connections. One connection from the user to the caching server, and then another connection from the caching server to the backend server. So there will be two connections. And even though it can be because of the distance, those individual connections can be slightly faster. In this example, 60 milliseconds. But the fact that you have two of them will make it as a whole slower. It will be 120 milliseconds, which is 30% slower. So it varies. Sometimes an external CDN system might make sites faster, but not necessarily always. So be sure that you measure before and after, and that you validate that if you're using a CDN server, does it actually make your site any faster? And here are some Seravo's features regarding server caching. So we have HTTP level server caching by default for every single site we have hosted, and it is in the same place as the server itself. So there is no extra delay anywhere. This picture, it will be just one connection to the server because the website WordPress itself and the cache is in the same place. There will be no double connections going on. And you can also control this server level cache if you, for whatever reason, want to make sure it's clear. You can run this VP purge cache command over SSH, and you can also bypass it by pressing Ctrl F5 in your browser. That is like a deep page reload. It's not the normal F5, which does a normal reload, but this control tells browsers to tell the server that it wants to bypass all caches. And this also has the benefit that if you accidentally make some, let's say, a syntax error on your website and it stops working, and if there is still cached content in the server cache, then Seravo systems will serve that instead. That's called stale cache. And visitors will not notice that the site is broken because they are getting content from the cache, and that will save you for a while when you have time to fix the syntax error and the original site actually starts working again. Then the fresh content will be served to the visitors. All right. Then let's talk about WordPress Transients. How many of you are familiar with WordPress Transients? Yes, good. Some are. So the objective with transients is to avoid doing repeated heavy, either usually network activity or heavy database searches. And transients don't work automatically. It's something you need to opt in your code to utilize. And we will be publishing these slides after the webinar, so you can go and check them out. And open the links here. So in WordPress documentation, there is a transient API described, and it's very simple. So basically, you have three main functions: get transient, set transient, and delete transient. And here is a code example of how it works. So instead of always doing the database query, we have in this example wrapped it with functions to check if there is a transient existing and use that instead. So this database query here is very, very simple. In reality, you wouldn't cache this because it's a fast and simple query, but this is just as an example. So the if line, if false equals featured get transient, full featured posts. So this full featured post is just the name that we've arbitrarily selected ourselves as a developer, and we will check if we get any results from the cache, from the transient cache with this name. And if we get something, then we are happy with that. And if this evaluates to false, then we will do the actual query and get the results from there, and also save this result, and in this example for 12 hours. So once this runs once, then it will use the transient content for 12 hours until it expires. So obviously, you can use this only for content that is okay to be cached for 12 hours, not something that is frequently updating. And how this works is that WordPress will store this in the VP options table as a database record. And then you might be asking, why are you storing a database query in a database row? Because then you're anyway going to have some database traffic. Yes, you will have database traffic, but you will not have the heavy database traffic. You will have a very simple query that just fetches one item from the database. And if you have a server environment that has some plugins for this, and for example, in Seravo's case, we have a server called Redis running in all of our environments, and we have this object cache.php plugin or drop-in on the sites. So it will actually not be using the regular database at all, but it will be used this custom Redis database server, which is a memory-only database. It's very simple and super fast. And transients are hugely useful, and we are, for example, using lots of transients on our own website to avoid getting the same content from the database all the time. And also another use case is, for example, if you have a Facebook plugin and you get some social feed from Facebook servers, and instead of doing that request all the time on every page load, you can do that request like once a minute or once every 10 minutes, and then store the result in a transient, and rest of the time just use the result from the transient, and then you will have less network traffic, and your page load will not always depend on how fast or how slow the Facebook API server is. Then there is also something called object cache inside WordPress, and this is stored in PHP's own memory, and this helps repetitive database queries during the same page load. And here are a code example. So these are the VP_cache prefixed functions. And this use case is quite similar, but this is in the PHP memory, and this will not be shared between the different requests. So for a regular WordPress site developer, the transient API is actually what you want to use, and probably not this one. So learn how to use the transient API. All right, then we have the file system cache. So here the objective is to avoid unnecessary hard drive operations because, as discussed, the accessing information from a disk is much slower than accessing it from a central memory. And this is something you can't control from PHP code. This is something you need to configure properly in your server environment and your operating system. And for Seravo's customers, we are running Linux and we have our file systems configured and optimized, so you don't need to do anything about this yourself. Then in the database, also you want to avoid the database process itself from accessing the hard drive too frequently, and you need to have database cache configured. And if you're a Seravo customer, then this is also covered for you and you don't need to bother yourself about it because you will be enjoying how we've optimized the InnoDB buffers and other things in the database. All right. So then when we're talking about performance and caching, something that also should be mentioned is profiling your PHP code. So profiling is the act when you are recording what functions and how many times and for how long PHP is triggering when it's doing a page load. And Xdebug is the go-to tool for doing that in a local development environment. But there are also tools that can do this in production environments without slowing down the website too much. And at Seravo, we recommend this service called Tideways, and we have a built-in integration for it if you want to use it. And here is an example of a Tideways report about the page load. And here you can see all of these SQL queries and these red bars telling you that most of the page load time is spent in doing countless database queries. So then if you dig in what these database queries are, you will notice that it's getting the WordPress posts over and over again. And that isn't really helpful because, for example, on our web page, we are publishing a new blog post like maybe once a week or something like that. So it can easily be cached for an hour or so. So then you can dig in what pieces in your theme code, for example, are doing these queries and then save those results in a transient and then reuse the contents of the transient as long as it's valid. And that way you will get, your site will become like hundreds of % faster. If you go to this blog post here, linked down here, you can read a story about how we optimized our own website using transients. And if you want to use Xdebug or Tideways, you can go to seravo.com docs, and there is our developer documentation, which will tell you coding tips, and explain in detail how to use these tools. So we have our own documentation specifically for WordPress site developers. And whatever caching you are doing, the purpose of the caching is to make the site load faster. So you should always be able to validate before and after how slow your site was and how fast it came when you started saving stuff in transient, for example, and serving it out of the transient cache. All right, and that was what you need to know about WordPress and caching. Thank you. All right, do you have any questions? So we have a question from Ross. Do the majority of web servers still use hard drives instead of SSDs? So I think that nowadays SSDs is the norm. And SSDs are not even the fastest thing anymore. The fastest thing is to use PCIe NVMe disks. Here, so you can see that the traditional spinning hard drives, HDD, are slow, and SSDs are like 10 times faster. But then PCIe NVMe disks are even faster than SSD hard disks. And if you place an order for a site at Seravo, then your site will be running on PCIe disks. I recommend checking out our developer documentation. And also, if you're interested in improving the performance of specific websites, you should check out Tideways. It's a very handy service to help visualize what is the bottleneck of performance on in your PHP code. All right, no more questions. Thanks everybody for attending. Bye-bye.